Excellent. Thank you, David, and indeed, good afternoon and welcome all. So I guess by way of context, ESG is for many treasury teams quite a new hat that they have to wear, and quite a confusing one. I think it's now quite well established within the finance community that it is an essential topic to get right to secure your future debt and lending market access, and I think for companies more generally maintain a strong competitive position. Yet at the same time, the topic of ESG can feel like a cacophony of developments, an alphabet soup of initiatives. What is it that you have to focus on amidst limited management time available? And I think for that backdrop, we've decided to set up this ESG investor panel and discussion to really hear from the buy side, what are the topics that matter, or what are topics that companies need to really focus on. For the next hour or so, we'll talk about three specific categories. We'll spend some time talking about sustainability reporting, about sustainability labeled debt issuance, and about ESG ratings and scoring mechanics. And for that session, I'm really pleased to have four thought leaders from the ESG investor community with us this afternoon to discuss these topics. And we have Joshua Kendall from Insight. We have Salima Lamduar from Alliance Bernstein. We have Daniel Krichev from Affirmative. And finally, we have Saida Eggerstedt from Schroders, who's joining through an audio line. So without further ado, let's commence with the session. And indeed, as David has said, please do submit your questions as well. And for the final 20 minutes or so, we'll have time to go through those. Let's begin with the company sustainability reporting. And perhaps, Salima, from your perspective, when you open up a company's sustainability report, what are the areas you are looking for?
So when we open up sustainability reports for companies, there are very few blanket statements that we're looking for across industries. We do look at things like whether the company has signed up to the UN Global Compact. We will look at what is the overall sustainability strategy of the company, what has been the thought process, who is the sustainability officer, what is the thought process behind the sustainability strategy. But really beyond that, we have to go industry by industry. So what we would expect to see from a utility company will be very different from what we expect to see from a pharmaceutical company or perhaps a food and beverage company. For utility company, we really will pay attention to decarbonization plan and decarbonization plans away from, say, if you're a electricity generating company, whether you're changing your fuel mix from fossil fuels into renewables, whereas for like a food producing company with a complex supply chain, we will see what sort of detail you are providing on that side of things. So really, as a company, you need to think about what is material, what is your societal and environmental impact, and what is the most material, and really address these subjects openly and candidly. Going forward, I think we will pay as an organization a lot more attention to reporting in accordance with the EU taxonomy. This is something that is going to affect us from next year. It is something where all our funds, which are domiciliated in Europe, so if you think as an investor, a lot of investors who are selling products to their European client base, but also in Asia, have funds domiciliated in Europe, and those come in scope with regards to the EU taxonomy. So even if you are a company domiciliated in the US or outside of the European Union, but an asset manager is managing money or is investing in you via a UCITS type of vehicle, which is pretty common. then you come under scope with the EU taxonomy. So really, we encourage companies to pay attention to this very closely and try to see if they can, to the extent of what is available at the moment, and as new guidance come for additional sectors, to really see if they can map their activity to the EU taxonomy. And then finally, when a significant controversy affects your company, we expect the companies to be quite open and engaging in dialogue with investors. We had, in our suite of companies that we invest in, either on the credit side or on the equity side, we have been affected by controversies in our portfolios. And we have seen a wide range of responses from companies. So there's the one company which had pretty headline-grabbing controversies with regards to some of their activities in emerging markets. We went and engaged with them. We felt that the management response was inadequate, and there was perhaps a culture of learned ignorance within management, and we ended up downgrading the fundamental rating of the company based on ESG concerns. On the other hand, we had another company who was also involved in pretty headline-grabbing controversies with regards to their operations, and we engaged with them, and very quickly they recognized there was an issue and engaged pretty openly. And we actually have ongoing dialogue with these guys probably every 3 to 4 months, and we are very pleased with the responses that we are getting. And despite this company having a pretty low ESG score on MSCI, for example, we are comfortable holding this company both in our conventional accounts and in our ESG thematic credit and equity strategies as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Salima. And perhaps turning it to Daniel, and as an impact investor at Affirmative, you clearly look at these reports with a lot of detail, with a very particular lens. Could you give any guidance what companies need to be including in their sustainability report, I guess regardless of sector, to make sure that you can do the necessary analysis at your end?
Thank you very much, Arthur. I would just sort of second what Salima said in terms of the sector, the fact that it's sector specific, right? I mean, in terms of the substance of the report, this is going to differ by industry, by sector. In terms of overarching themes, there are a number of areas that we do look very closely and that we do look to sustainability reports for. And sort of you could sort of categorize those in sort of 3 areas. The first being policy disclosure. The second being strategies and targets. And finally, the third being reporting on performance. So in terms of policy disclosure, we really like to see upfront as much information as possible as what policies are in place within the company or within the issuer relating to sustainability, pertaining to their social objectives as well. That really allows us that speeds up the process in some ways when we're digging deeper into a company, if that information is provided in a very clear way and linking those policies to the sustainability strategy of the company. In terms of strategies and targets, I think that goes without saying that a sustainability report should outline what the company or the issuer is actually doing with regard to the topic at hand, right? And so we really like to see long-term comprehensive strategies and really sort of ambitious targets and quantitative targets whenever possible. So things like net zero commitments, targets around biodiversity protection and biodiversity impact are very, very are of great interest to us. And also in terms of some of the social metrics as well. So whether that has to do with gender and diversity within the company itself, or what it's doing through its operations to have a positive impact or to mitigate negative impacts. And finally, I think in terms of reporting, there are a number of things that are very useful in this respect. And I think the first, as I've already said, is whenever possible, are really quantitative indicator reporting. So if we're talking about climate change, we're interested to see greenhouse gas reporting, whether that's the TCFD or otherwise, including methodologies. And it's also quite helpful, I think, to see historical trends. So if the company has a long-term strategy dating back several years to achieve a certain level of greenhouse gas emissions through its operations, or to be net zero by such and such date, to see how the progress has been made over time. Because we do take into account, of course, things such as absolute performance in these areas, but we also take account of trends. And we like to see demonstrated progress in terms of implementing strategies.
Perfect. Thank you, Daniel. And actually, on that topic of implementing strategies, clearly we talk about ESG, and I know, Josh, you've been, I think, quite articulate that from your perspective, that the G is actually really quite critical. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here with you all today. I guess the genesis for that question is we're reaching a point now where there's a proliferation and discussion and talk about environmental and social issues, and rightly so, because there are clearly risks out there emerging in the short term and the long term on the environmental and social issues. There's relentless pressure from our stakeholders, society, the media, regulators to focus on this issue. And clearly, when we look at the inequality in the world, the threats from climate change, it's absolutely relevant to also spend a lot of time focused on this issue. But from a financial perspective, many of these risks appear to be very much on the horizon. They don't necessarily have an impact in financial markets today compared to governance issues. And it's governance issues which tend to be the biggest driver of performance. And secondly, it is also a good parameter, an indicator of how a company manages its environmental and social risks too. So for that reason, we have continued to focus on the relevance of governance overall in understanding a company's overall sustainability strategy and performance. And that's for that reason why we've started to introduce our own internal proprietary ESG rating. And I'm not sure if I can go into this subject now, Arthur, but the genesis for developing internal ratings as opposed to relying on a third party is that those third parties tend to mix up lots of different signals. As an investor focusing on risk, we're here to identify what are the materials which we believe can have an impact on performance today and in portfolios over time. And we've got a very different view to many third parties out there. And when we look at our internal methodology compared to those third parties, it's quite clear that we put the emphasis on governance risk predominantly at a higher weighting versus environmental and social risk, because that is still a better measure for us of a company's overall risk, and also is an opportunity for us to focus on sustainability risk, namely environmental and social issues, when we see governance problems emerging as well. So it's for that reason that we take a focus on governance as a starting point, and that leads us to also explore environmental and social issues.
Great, thank you, Josh. And perhaps turning to Saida now, and I know one area you are also quite focused on is the stakeholder engagement, be that communities or other stakeholders of companies. Could you perhaps elaborate on what you see as best in class sort of behavior on that front?
Well, I think my previous speaker, he talked a bit about governance, and looking at stakeholders is an extension of that. And we see through the cycles, social or economic cycle, there are different stakeholders that become important. So let's say, if you take a challenged sector like the auto sector, where there have been quite a bit of environmental regulations lately about, and certain actors have also worked in a way that has really destroyed the trust in the sector. And as we know, as ESG investors, we cannot buy certain names because whether it's UNGC violation, whether it's MSCI rating, whether it's warning sign, those tend to be backward looking. And one way that companies can actually show that they actually care about different stakeholders is engaging with us as investors. And as you know, the previous three speakers have demonstrated, ESG investors, they do ask more questions. And when companies, engage with us, we can also give them some feedback. But it's equally important that they engage with their customers. So coming back to the auto sector, I think many of the auto companies were not producing enough electric vehicles, for example, because they were so scared of if customers can make the change, and if it's just money spent on research and development or marketing or capex, which will not generate profit or margins. But now we see how it has changed. So the companies which has actually looked 5 years ahead and invested because they thought of the regulators, they thought about the clients, they thought about the investors, but importantly, they have thought also about the future generation, which is a stakeholder. And for that, we need this environmental transition. And companies who have also taken their employees as stakeholders. So in times of COVID-19, when we're all now, we can't really see each other face to face, but people still want their job security, they want to work. But equally, the companies want to also transit them to new technology or different kind of roles, still keep them motivated. And as well, suppliers. So I think, most of the world actually forgot about suppliers for quite a few years, and we all benefited from globalization. And now, we spent at Schroders when the first thing that came was supply chain shock, and then of course came the demand shock. But and suppliers are very important stakeholders. For example, even, I wouldn't say the word even, but, positively surprised, like even countries like Brazil, when a paper maker is engaging with the local farmers and people who are deforesting and, giving them some lessons that they should not do deforestation. Is a win-win situation for the, future generation. And this engagement with suppliers is also a win-win situation because then you can manage your working capital. So when we do engagement, and me being also a fund manager, there is the sustainability sides and different stakeholders, but we try to also align it with the investment side as well. So that is how the sustainability investment becomes long-term. And when a company can successfully demonstrate that they consistently are engaging with their different stakeholders and not just equity holders, it's not just about paying dividends, but really taking care of all the stakeholders, they will be more sustainable over longer term. And many of the numbers my colleague from Impact Investing is asking for, those numbers will be also easy to produce. So that's why I think it's important that also in the report there is some mention also how you're engaging with the communities, how you're engaging with your co-workers, how you're engaging with the suppliers, how are you engaging with the clients who might actually need a credit or a longer term period. So like the housing companies, real estate companies who issue a lot of bonds, are they actually on one hand benefiting from, maybe people will be more conscious about the health, about the environment, but also on the other hand, if people cannot pay the rent, how are you engaging with them to have long-term relationships? And of course, we are accredited investors, so we look at the financials as well. But
I'm sorry, we're losing your audio. I'm just going to hand back to Arthur, if you wouldn't mind trying to redial in.
Thank you, Saida. Yes, it seems that there was a bit of an audio shock there, but hopefully we can remedy that. But I think the previous speakers raised a number of important areas of focus when it comes to sustainability report construction, be that the stakeholder engagement, be that policies, be that targets. And clearly that's a lot to think about from a company perspective, which is why there's been the development of various reporting frameworks, be that GRI, be that SASB. And Josh, from your perspective, is there any particular reporting framework or standards that you're wedded to, that you would guide companies towards or do you think many of them have a lot of overlapping sort of features and benefits?
I have sympathy for issuers looking at this issue. What's the appropriate framework? There's a plethora of them. There is SASB, there's GRI, there's Inside Zone framework. There are so many out there. It can be confusing. What's the appropriate way to measure your performance, and how do you track that over time? And I suppose there are obviously some well-used frameworks like SASB and GRI, and those are the probably pragmatic and really relevant for many companies out there. But I wouldn't be so focused on what's the appropriate reporting standard or framework. There's a huge overlap between them all. And I think what companies are looking for, what investors are looking for is for companies to communicate the material information that's relevant. So the speakers today have all mentioned that we're focusing on materiality. We're not looking at every issue. We're looking at issues relevant for the sector or for the individual business. And arguably, that's going to be more relevant when looking to communicate with your investor community. So we do see it as being a process which is going to be focusing on what's material rather than what's the right framework. And that's going to be really relevant because what's relevant and material today is evolving. So some of those older ESG frameworks probably not so relevant today, but as we can see with the EU taxonomy, that may be a framework or a set of guides that will be more relevant in the future. And there is also this focus on impact and trying to achieve impact. Many of those ESG reporting frameworks, like SASB and GRI, are much more focused on risk. And that's going to be relevant for most investors, but increasingly you get a focus on, are you changing the world? What kind of difference are you making? And there really aren't enough frameworks looking at this specific issue, which basically means we're going to see this industry evolve and develop new frameworks, new guides for both investors and companies. And I think it's going to be relevant here for everybody involved just to have that regular opportunity to discuss these issues, to take note of how the industry is changing, and make sure that as you look to update your reporting on sustainability on an annual basis, that you're carrying the right information that's going to be relevant for investors. The one thing that I would add that is going to be relevant for all the companies, and I would certainly encourage everyone in this call to pay attention to it, is CDP. The CDP is the flagship body which promotes environmental reporting. And whilst there are around 1,500, 1,800 companies that report on their climate emissions and activities on an annual basis, that's still not enough. So if there are not companies on this call listening, who are listening and are not completing the annual CDP questionnaire, that'd be the one area that I would look for them to develop.
Thank you very much for that, Josh. I guess turning now from sustainability strategies to sustainability labeled debt issuances, and often a question we get from companies is, well, I have a very ESG focused strategy as a company overall. What's really the benefit or the add-on for me channeling that into a framework, into a specific piece of debt like a green bond? And perhaps, Ida, I'll turn to you first, and let's hope the line sort of improved a little bit. But why, from your perspective, should a company issue a green bond? I think the connection is still, we're still struggling a little bit with the connection there. So let me move on to Daniel, and I guess particularly
Arthur, can you hear me now? Or
yeah, it's still a little bit shaky, unfortunately, Seda. So we may have to ask you to dial back in. Daniel, from your perspective as an impact investor, what's the value for you in purchasing green bonds as opposed to regular bonds?
So just to provide a little bit of a context, affirmative investment management, we are a fixed income investor that focuses on investments that generate positive social and environmental returns. In practice, the majority of investments are labeled use of proceeds bonds, so green, social, and sustainability bonds. We do, in some cases, purchase unlabeled bonds, particularly for pure play issuers or other issuers who are closely aligned with our objectives and with our strategies. From our perspective, from an investor perspective, the advantage of a labeled use of proceeds bond is multifaceted. On the one hand, it provides certainly a greater level of transparency in terms of where the money, where the funds are actually going to be allocated, and it allows us to really track, particularly for issuers who may have various areas of operation, say for financial institutions, or in some cases other types of companies as well, to ensure that the funds that we invest are going to be used in sectors and areas and projects that are aligned with our own objectives and with our own strategies. Another area that I think is crucial as an impact investor, we're very much focused on impact reporting. So our clients, people who invest with us, are very much focused on understanding what the quantitative terms, the impact that these funds are having. So a use of proceeds bond, and particularly the commitments to reporting on clear KPIs, provide a very, very key component of our strategy, of our investment strategy.
Excellent, thank you. I think when it comes to green bond investments, clearly they're the ICMA guidelines, but many investors have their own approach to scoring and differentiating between green bonds. And so Salima, I know at AllianceBernstein there is a 4-step process that you apply. Could you briefly run us through that, please?
So, as you said, at AllianceBernstein, we developed a proprietary 4-step process to see if a green bond aligns with, what we think should be a green bond. So, our approach, if I look at it from a holistic perspective, all of the green bonds that we do see as quote unquote valid from our perspective fit within the ICMA guideline. But as you said, we apply this additional filter, which is a 4-step filter. The first 2 steps are applied to all our investments across our franchise, and that's valuation and fundamentals. We are still trying to generate superior risk-adjusted returns for our clients. When I say valuation, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't buy a green bond through their conventional curve, because we are cognizant of the technicals in this market. So we run a thematic global credit fund, which isn't only a green bond fund, but has a minimum of 20% in green bonds. And what we have seen during the COVID volatility, for example, is that we had been running about 30% in green bonds in that portfolio in the run-up to the market volatility and to dry up in liquidity. And what we have found is that we were able to recycle those green bonds in the market to take advantage of pretty chunky new issue premium in the primary, where we wouldn't have been able to do the same with conventional bonds. So we have a technology tool that we developed in-house, which sort of compiles all the axes from the market, both from brokers and also from platform. And we found that despite the European green bond market making up 2% of the overall European credit market, about 10% of the bid axes at the height of the volatility were for green bonds. So we think green bonds is a very interesting volatility mitigation instrument for investors, both thematic and conventional. So those are the first 2 pillars, valuation and fundamentals. And then the third pillar is use of proceeds, and the fourth pillar is how does the green bond fit within the overall sustainability strategy of the company. So looking at the use of proceeds, we will again look at where the proceeds are being deployed. Increasingly, we are taking note of alignment with the EU taxonomy, as I mentioned before, specifically for green bonds. We are looking at perhaps unintended consequences that may arise from investment in green bonds. I would like to say we were a forethinkers the do no significant harm principle, which is embedded in the EU taxonomy. So we do look at, if you're building a big hydroelectric dam, are you affecting the biome, or are you displacing populations as a result? And then finally, we are cognizant that a lot of the issuers are issuing green bonds to lower the cost of capital. And that's fine if you have a comprehensive top-down sustainability strategy, because we think that over time you will become a better credit anyway. But if you are just opportunistically using green assets to lower the cost of capital for the one specific issue, then that's something that we're a bit wary of. And then going back to Daniel's comment, we will also monitor impact, and we will look at where the funds have been deployed, but we will also look for any change in strategy from the top down from the issuer. And there have been instances where we have divested from green bonds where the proceeds from the bonds were deployed in accordance with the green bond framework, but we felt that there was a change in strategy from the issuer, from the top-down sustainability perspective, that made us a little bit more cautious.
Perfect. No, thank you for that, Salima. And at Insight, Josh, I know you also have a mechanism for scoring and assessing green bonds, the traffic light system. Can you talk us through that, please?
The first area, I'll start again. The first area that we cover off in our methodology is the overall sustainability performance of the issuer. The reason this is important is clearly you have an increase in number of companies looking to issue these impact bonds, but there are question marks over their overall sustainability strategy. We believe it's absolutely critical that if a company is looking to issue a green bond, that they have to have strong governance. They have to have avoided controversial activities and behaviours that most of these buyers of impact bonds are very sensitive to. So that's a key part of our framework. The second is the framework itself. We want transparency over how the money is used, the reporting cycle, the governance over the use of those proceeds as well. And then the final area is going to be the quantitative impact. So what's the additionality? So it's very similar to the other methodologies out there. We've been doing this, the evaluation of impact bonds since 2017. And in that time, we've evaluated more than 200 impact bonds from issuers. So it's quite a substantial database that we have of companies and the performance of these particular instruments. Last year, we evaluated around 120. And of those 120 different green, social, or sustainability bonds, approximately 1/4 failed our sustainability criteria, meaning we do not add them to our client sustainability portfolios, and fully only 1/3 passed our criteria in full. If we're looking at the performance of this year, definitely there's been an improvement. And that's because there's better communication between issuers of these impact bonds with investors like Insight, who are interested to understand a bit more about whether their green bonds or social bonds meet minimum criteria. And so it's very encouraging to see the improvement that we're seeing from companies. And we're hoping to see the reduction in the number of companies that we're giving a red flag to.
Thank you for that. And that leads me to turn to our third topic, ESG ratings and scoring mechanics. And perhaps, Daniel, turning to you first of all, I'm mindful at Affirmative, you've developed your own verification and impact system. And can you perhaps elaborate on how you then go about assessing companies using that system?
Absolutely. So yes, we of course, when we look at an impact bond framework or an issuer that comes through, we do subject them to what I think is a fairly rigorous multi-step process of assessment, and that really has two dimensions. On the one hand, I think as we're talking about ESG, you have the traditional kind of ESG screening which takes place, and to look at whether this is a responsible issuer, whether it meets the thresholds for our exclusionary criteria, and whether the issuer itself is aligned with our values and with our own sector taxonomy. Beyond that, and I think other impact investors are also engaged in the same thing, we're also screening and evaluating for the actual positive impact that the bond or the issuer is actually having. So in this case, we look at the positive externalities. We look at the context in which the issuer is operating. So whether it's a national or international policy context, we look at the social context in which they're operating. And we also look at the materiality of the use of proceeds to the issuer and to the sector itself. So all of these things are taken into account as we evaluate. And I think, as Josh said, we do. Not every issuer gets through that process, and the purpose of it is designed to ensure that not only do we have the most responsible issuers in our universe, but also the most impactful ones. And I think the question was about ESG data, if I'm not mistaken. And ESG data certainly has an important role to play in that process. But I think it's important to stress that we do look at ESG ratings. We don't rely solely on ESG ratings in making an assessment or a decision. And the greater level of granularity that we have about the data behind those ESG ratings, the better, because it allows us to generate our own assessment and essentially our own ESG rating of the issuer.
Excellent. And Saeed, perhaps turning it to you, I'm mindful at Schroders, you've developed an elaborate methodology to help with the ESG scoring and assessment of companies. Can you talk us through how that's been constructed and the kind of data feeds and inputs that you use for that, please?
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay, all right. So, yes, I think, at Schroders, we've had a long tradition, actually, at looking at it from more on the equity side, and that has been transferred also to the debt side over the last few years. So we do look at various kinds of climate-related data. CDP is one of them, but we also look at all kinds of intensity, carbon intensity, depending on the industry, and other greenhouse gas emissions as well. We look at many, kind of NGO kind of news flow, but also historical data. And when we look at something like, salaries or how employers are treating their employees, then employers are treating their employees, then we also look in the national context, because it is important that we kind of contextualize the ESG data, not just sector, but also countries, and so in an industry context and country context. And on the social side, also like customer, if it's a bank, if it's taking care of the data security, that's also important. If it's a retailer or a cloth manufacturer, there are numbers how they have dealt with controversial supply chain issues. And for governance, of course, there is always the usual thing about boards and all that, but increasingly also diversity numbers, forward-looking. That's very important. So the sets of data we look at, it increases with the interaction we make on one hand with the companies themselves, because it's important to be nice to companies as well, because they might think certain data is important for them to produce, because that is also, if it's a part of their strategy, if top management is involved, it also gives the numbers more credibility. So it's not just by the numbers themselves, but the credibility of it and the motivation to move forward. So we use all kinds of numbers. Sometimes numbers are not even available, so we go back to the company, we ask for numbers, and they get to know us, and they get surprised, oh, actually, you're looking at these numbers. So it's kind of give and take process, I guess.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think that takes it to our Q&A session. And perhaps I'll ask the operator, David, just to remind everyone how you can ask questions for that.
Thank you, Arthur. Yes, if I can just remind our guests today, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do this by typing your question into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, or if you prefer, you can press the raise hand button in the Zoom app, and we'll bring you into the meeting and you ask your question in person by unmuting your device. Thank you, Arthur. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, David. We have had a few questions come in the past half hour or so. I think the first one is incredibly topical. It comes from Elliot Nettleship. To what level will corporate reactions to topical items this year feature in your investment decisions? In particular, COVID-19 and colleague wider social diversity issues arising from the Black Lives Matter movement. Can I ask Selina to comment on that, please?
So I would say I would say those topical items, rather than bringing an additional point of focus for us, just kind of showcase how important it is to pay attention to the issues that we have already been paying attention to. So Saida mentioned previously stakeholder engagement. That is something that is part of our ESG assessment, and that's something that we have been looking at on the governance as part of our governance scoring framework for a while. And as you know, as you mentioned, those have come to the fore with the COVID-19 crisis, and so I wouldn't say we are. It has made us expand the topics that we are looking at. It has just brought to the fore the importance of looking at issues that have already been incorporated in our ESG assessment framework, and perhaps maybe put a little bit more, help us contextualize those issues and their materiality a little bit better.
Perfect. Thank you, Selina. The next question we have, and I think this is a really interesting topic as well, is how do you feel about investing in KPI-linked ESG bonds rather than the more traditional use of proceeds ESG bonds? Do you have a preference? Saida, do you have a strong view on this new instrument of KPI-linked debt?
Yeah. So I think so. At AB, we are big proponents of this type of structure, and we think it works actually really well for the sectors that are perhaps a little bit behind with regards to transitioning on to the low carbon economy. So the high emitting sectors such as energy, maybe cement, I can put in that bucket. We think importantly, and going back to the disclosure on sustainability reports, we think the issuers that are thinking thinking about coming to this market need to have a long-term decarbonization strategy with near-term milestones. So as to issue a 7-year bond with a KPI that kicks in after, say, 3 or 5 years. We think it's a very powerful instrument. We'd like the KPIs to be broad-based, to be able to enable us to compare within industry, issues within industry and across industry. So for high emitting industries, we'd like to have a GHG KPI as opposed to, one company wanting to, one utility company wanting to increase the share of renewables in their mix, the other one wanting to decrease the share of coal. We'd like to have this sort of broad-based KPI that can be applied across the industry and perhaps across many industries, and have it aligned with science-based targets. So have it aligned with 1.5 degree scenario, for example. So this is how we envisage a KPI link bond. The other thing I would say is we would like the issuer to have a soft commitment to transitioning their whole capital structure towards this, because it's one thing having a 25 basis points coupon step on one of the bonds that you issue, the monetary impact, if you don't hit the KPI, is actually not that material. Whereas if you transition your whole capital structure towards this model, then the incentive is a lot larger for the issuer, and it gives us more comfort as investors to invest in this type of bond. But broadly, we really like this structure. I mean, we're looking forward to see the next bond, to see the next issuer after Enel tapping this market. We are cognizant of challenges with regards to ECB eligibility for European debt and so forth. But that's our view.
Yeah, I think we are looking forward to seeing that pipeline indeed grow. Daniel, turning to you, there's an interesting question here about monetization of impact. What do you think are the impediments and the opportunities?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. Monetization of impact. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think that this is about all we have from the questioner. But my guess is that they're trying to address this ongoing debate of is impact investing potentially a restriction on the financial returns you can otherwise get. So how do you look at generating impact versus generating alpha in a fund?
I mean, so as an investor, we're focused on mainstream returns in the fixed income space. So I don't, we don't make a trade-off in that sense between the impact and the returns that we generate. In terms of monetizing the impact itself, from our view, that we don't quantify the impact in terms of dollars invested in a comparable way. For example, we had a conversation about this recently, actually, whether you could compare children vaccinated with carbon emissions avoided on the one hand. And I think that for quite complex reasons, I think quite obvious reasons, it doesn't make sense to compare these things in dollar terms, right? So when we report impact, we're really looking at quantitative and verifiable, but indicative metrics of what our funds are actually achieving.
That makes sense. No, thank you, Daniel. And perhaps turning to Josh, we have a question here in terms of your view on the main changes in the green bond market and indeed in your ESG approach in recent years.
There's two questions there. So the first part to that is the big change is clearly how more companies are looking to issue green bonds, and I'm going to come to a different opinion to some of my peers on sustainability-linked bonds. This is clearly the next step where people are thinking about, well, they might not meet the criteria to issue a green bond because they might be a cement company or an oil and gas company. Should they look to issue a sustainability-linked bond? This is a common question that I get, and my response is it's not absolutely necessary to do that. And I can understand there might be an urgency to do that because there are that many of these instruments and it can be quite good to be one of the first. However, as an ESG investor, our number one objective isn't just to promote green bonds and put them into sustainability portfolios. Our objective is to manage risk. It's to identify risk, mitigate risk, work with companies to isolate those risk factors and get comfort that they are working towards a strategy that can reduce it over time. And for us to work together to remove some of those material risk factors over time. And that's the basis in which we as an ESG investor articulate our role regarding ESG information, ESG risk, and by extension impact as well. There is certainly a need for impact because there are great challenges out there. But for many companies looking at those challenges, we actually believe it's much more important to focus on the material risk factors and focus on mitigating them as much as possible. And by doing that, you will be rewarded by having stronger ESG ratings. And you will be rewarded by having more sanguine, happier investors who are going to work with you and want to invest with you through challenging periods ahead, because we know that you are putting sustainability at the forefront. Having a labeled instrument is not a parameter of your success or failure as a company on sustainability. It can be relevant for some companies, but ordinarily it shouldn't dictate whether you are going to be seen in a good or a bad light from us as investors. So definitely continue to focus on ESG. The green market, to answer this question, is certainly rapidly evolving to cover off all these different areas of elements, the social and sustainability. And whilst that's important, again, is that the focus from companies needs to be on what's going to be most relevant for investors, and that is to reduce the harm as much as possible, become good stewards of their stakeholders, their own clients, their own supply chain, and make sure that they are working on that specifically. The second part of your question is much more about what we're doing internally. I think that was what the question was. And here, at Insight, So at Insight, clearly everyone is in the process of developing and enhancing their processes. At Insight, we've also introduced our own ESG ratings. The reason this is very important for those on the call is that historically, ESG ratings are very equity focused. And if you're a credit investor like Insight, that's not practical. There's a lot of stuff about shareholder rights. What about bondholder rights? We have different opinions on what's material in the short term and the long term. The next step for us is to develop ratings specific to the issues that we believe to be material. And this is going to be more relevant over time as climate change goes up the agenda for regulators, and we're going to be under pressure to demonstrate how we're factoring climate risk and how we're talking to companies about these issues. And so by developing more internal models, you're going to find that all investors will ultimately have very different opinions, and that will be very healthy because there should be less reliance on these independent third-party ESG rating agencies and much more about in-house internal innovation, which will mean there will be much more focus on talking to companies about the relevant issues rather than talking about issues that might not be relevant.
Great. And thanks for all the questions that have been coming in. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more, but it certainly gives us a lot of food for thought for the subsequent ESG investor panel sessions we'll be planning. So the final question, we'll direct this to you, Saida, at Schroders. And Josh mentioned climate risk. And of course, an important framework in reporting on that perspective is the TCFD disclosure framework. And how do you look at that from a Schroders perspective in terms of strengths and weaknesses?
I think we are actually delighted that this has come in because it gives companies also some guideline. I think I'm a bit more sympathetic to the audience than maybe everybody else because, it is a lot of data. So we look at it, but it's also important that the data is there, but it's communicated. So that's one thing that you just put it on the website, but you don't actually engage with investors. Because if you do, that shows confidence that you have actually looked at your numbers and how you do it. So we think any report is, better than none. And there are sectors, like if you're a bank and you're still, giving loans to the fossil fuel industry, then a part of it will come into the TCFD, but a part of it might be also something that you have to actually make an announcement and make it a part of responsible banking if you're talking about the banking sector. On the other hand, if you look at something like telecom sector, a sector which you would think from ESG point of view is very, innocent maybe, but the fact is that as we are all using a lot more internet and everything, this sector has a lot to contribute in carbon emission reduction. So when we look at those sectors, we actually learn about certain dynamics of the sector that we wouldn't have known otherwise if it wasn't there. But personally, I also like SASB reporting and the scenario analysis that SASB is going to ask from investors. And that is important going forward, because also for our fund managers, we have to actually disclose what risks we have in the portfolio, the companies we have, if we have done scenario analysis. So if TCFD is static, then in the future we have to find a way also how to do this scenario analysis and mitigation. And all this might sound a lot of work, but I think for the companies, the message is if they do that, they will also see how they actually find the opportunities for the future. Because just like a green bond reporting or impact reporting also shows that you're actually doing good stuff to make money as well. So I think it's a good start. There has to be scenario analysis, there has to be communication, and the opportunities that come out of the whole thing, that's also important.
Excellent. Thank you all. I think that's been a really multifaceted discussion, and I think a couple of the takeaways that I took from that were I guess, firstly, from a corporate perspective, don't get hung up with a particular framework or a particular rating. Really have a reflective process in terms of what are the policies, the targets that are most material for my business profile, for my sector, and that will really feed across to your investor base. I think we discussed green bonds as well, and I think the panel made clear that does provide a very important overlay for a lot of investment strategies. And I think finally, when it comes to ESG ratings, it doesn't sound like these are blindingly accepted by any of the members from the panel. It is data, it is input, but ultimately the investors will make up their own mind in terms of the ESG strengths and weaknesses of the company. Welcome very much to the feedback of those of you that have attended. This is the first of this format of event, and we plan to do these every 6 weeks or so, given the ever-evolving nature of sustainability and ESG thinking. And indeed, your NatWest or NatWest Markets sales contact will be in touch with you when we set up the next session. And finally, let me thank again the panel for their fantastic contributions this afternoon and the time they've taken. And with that, let me conclude the session. Thank you all.